The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban neighborhood. Inside the modest two-story house, the air was thick with tension. Dinner had been silent, the clinking of silverware against plates, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. Emma sat at the head of the table, her auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun, her eyes darting nervously between her husband, Mark, and her stepson, Jake. Mark's jaw was clenched, his fork tapping rhythmically against his plate, while Jake stared down at his food, his teenage shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. "What's going on?" Jake finally broke the silence, his voice cracking slightly. He looked up, his green eyes, so much like his father's, clouded with confusion and suspicion. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced at Mark, who had stopped tapping his fork and was now glaring at her with a mix of anger and hurt. He knows, she thought, her stomach twisting into knots. Oh God, he knows. Emma, Mark said, his voice low and controlled but laced with venom, why don't you tell Jake what's been going on? Emma's hands trembled as she set her fork down. She could feel Jake's eyes on her, searching for answers she wasn't ready to give. How did it come to this? She wondered, her mind racing back to the moment it all began, the moment she'd made the decision that would change everything. It had started innocently enough. Emma had been attending yoga classes 3 times a week, a routine she'd picked up to cope with the stress of blending her life with Mark and Jake's. It was there that she'd met Daniel, the charming instructor with an easy smile and a knack for making her feel seen. At first, it was just friendly banter after class, a quick coffee here and there. But then the texts started, harmless at first, but gradually growing more frequent, more personal. "You looked amazing today," he'd texted her one evening after class. "I can't stop thinking about you." Emma had stared at her phone, her heart pounding. She'd told herself it was just a compliment, nothing more. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. And yet, she didn't stop it. She didn't delete the message. Instead, she'd replied with a simple, "Thank you. I had a great time today too." From there, it had spiraled. Late-night conversations, secret meetups, stolen kisses in the park. It's just a fling, she'd told herself, trying to justify her actions. It doesn't mean anything. But it did. It meant everything. And now, sitting at the dinner table with Mark's accusing glare and Jake's confused eyes, she realized the gravity of what she'd done. "Emma," Mark repeated, his voice sharper this time, snapping her back to the present. "Tell him." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Jake," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I made a mistake. A huge mistake." Jake's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "I've been seeing someone else," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Your father found out, and—" Jake's eyes widened in shock, his face draining of color. "You cheated on Dad?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "How could you? You're supposed to be part of this family." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to find the right words. "I'm so sorry, Jake," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you or your father. I was stupid and selfish, and Mark slammed his hand down on the table, making both Emma and Jake jump. "Enough," he barked, his face red with anger. "You don't get to play the victim here, Emma. You made your choices, and now you're going to live with the consequences." Emma wiped at her tears, her chest heaving with sobs. "Mark, please," she pleaded. "I know I messed up, but we can work through this. We can fix this." "Fix this?" Mark scoffed, his voice dripping with bitterness. "How, Emma? How do we fix this?" You betrayed me. You betrayed this family. Jake pushed his chair back from the table, his face a mask of anger and hurt. I can't believe you, he said, his voice shaking. I trusted you. I thought you were different. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, a harsh reminder of the chaos Emma had caused. She sat frozen, her mind reeling. How did it come to this? Mark stood, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm staying at a hotel tonight, he said, his voice cold and final. I need time to think. Mark, please, Emma begged, reaching out to him, but he pulled away, his eyes filled with pain. Don't, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just, don't. And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Emma alone in the suffocating silence. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing through the empty house. What have I done? Hours later, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank TV screen. She'd tried calling Mark, but he hadn't answered. She'd texted Jake, but her messages had gone unread. The weight of her guilt was crushing, and she felt utterly alone. The sound of the front door opening startled her, and she jumped to her feet. Mark, she called out, her voice hopeful as she hurried down the stairs. But it wasn't Mark who stood in the doorway, it was Jake. Jake, she said, her voice trembling with relief. You came back. He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with anger. Why, Emma? Why did you do it? Emma took a step toward him, her hands outstretched. Jake, I don't know. I was selfish and stupid, and I. Stop, he interrupted, his voice sharp. I don't want excuses. I just want to understand. Emma swallowed hard, her heart aching at the pain in his eyes. Your dad and we've been struggling, she admitted. And I let myself get caught up in something that made me feel wanted, needed. But that's no excuse. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry. Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. You don't get it, he said, his voice rising. You're not just my stepmom. You're part of my family. And now everything's ruined. Emma felt the tears welling up again, but she forced herself to stay strong. Jake, I know I can't take back what I've done, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. Please, just give me a chance. Jake stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in the doorway. Jake, wait, she called after him, but he didn't stop. The door slammed shut behind him, and Emma felt the weight of her mistake settle over her once more. How can I fix this? She wondered, her heart breaking as she sank to her knees. How can I make this right? The next morning, Emma woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She grabbed it, hoping it was Mark or Jake, but it was just a notification from her yoga studio, a reminder of Daniel's class that afternoon. She stared at the screen, her stomach churning with guilt and shame. Daniel, she thought, her mind racing. This is all his fault. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Daniel had been a temptation, but she was the one who'd given in. She was the one who'd betrayed her family. And now, she had to face the consequences. With a heavy heart, Emma picked up her phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Mark, it's me, she said, her voice trembling. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I love you, and I love Jake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, just call me back. She hung up, her hand shaking as she set the phone down. What if he doesn't call back? She wondered, her heart sinking. What if I've lost them forever? Later that day, Emma found herself standing outside Daniel's yoga studio, her stomach in knots. She knew she had to end things with him, for good. But as she reached for the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Mark's name on the screen. "Mark," she answered, her voice trembling with hope. There was a long pause before he finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." Chapter 2. Emma's hand hovered over the door handle of Daniel's yoga studio, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of Mark's words, "we need to talk," still lingered in her mind, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward Daniel. This is the last time, she told herself. One last conversation, and then it's over. She pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell announcing her arrival. The studio was quiet, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of incense. Daniel was at the far end of the room, rolling up a yoga mat. He glanced up, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unspoken, that made Emma's stomach twist. "Emma," he said, his voice low and steady. "What are you doing here?" She took a step forward, her hands trembling at her sides. I needed to see you. To talk." Daniel set the mat down and walked toward her, his movements deliberate. Too deliberate, Emma thought. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Talk?" he repeated, his tone tinged with skepticism. "Is that really why you're here?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Yes. No. I don't know." Her voice wavered, and she hated how weak she sounded. "Daniel, whatever this is, it has to stop. I can't keep doing this to Mark. To myself." Daniel's expression softened, and he reached out, gently touching her arm. "Emma, you have to stop punishing yourself. What happened between us, it wasn't just a mistake. It meant something. Doesn't it still?" She looked away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Of course it means something. But that doesn't make it right. Mark deserves better than this. I deserve better than this." Daniel stepped closer, his hand sliding down to grasp hers. His touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. What if you could have both? What if you didn't have to choose? Emma's breath hitched, and she pulled her hand away, taking a step back. "I can't, Daniel. I won't. This has to end." For a moment, he said nothing, just studied her with those piercing eyes. Then, slowly, he reached out again, this time cupping her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, sending a jolt of heat through her. "Do you really want it to end?" Emma's resolve wavered, her body betraying her as she leaned into his touch. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Then let me show you what you're giving up." Before she could protest, he closed the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a searing kiss. Emma's hands instinctively found their way to his chest, but instead of pushing him away, she clung to him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressing together as if trying to erase any space between them. Emma's mind raced, a whirlwind of guilt and desire, colliding within her. This is wrong, she thought, but her body didn't seem to care. Every touch, every caress, only fueled the fire that had been smoldering inside her since the first time they'd crossed that line. Daniel's hands roamed over her body, pulling her closer, his breath hot against her skin. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured between kisses. "Tell me to stop, and I will." But Emma couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she kissed him back with a fervor that surprised even herself. Daniel guided her toward the corner of the room, where a large, plush yoga mat lay neatly folded. He laid it out, his eyes never leaving hers, and then gently pressed her down onto it. Emma's heart pounded as she looked up at him, a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through her veins. "Daniel," she started, but he silenced her with another kiss, his hands roaming over her body, igniting every nerve ending. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his expression serious. "Emma, I need you to be sure. If you want me to stop, say it now." She hesitated, her mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. But then she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sure." That was all the confirmation he needed. Daniel's hands moved with purpose, peeling away her clothes with a gentleness that belied the hunger in his eyes. Emma's breath quickened as the cool air touched her exposed skin, but it was quickly replaced by the warmth of Daniel's body as he hovered over her, his lips trailing a path of fire down her neck and across her collarbone. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, her fingers digging into the taut muscles as he continued his exploration. Every touch, every kiss, was a reminder of what she was risking, but in that moment, she didn't care. The guilt that had been gnawing at her faded into the background, replaced by an all-consuming need. Daniel's hands moved lower, his fingers skimming over her hips and thighs, leaving trails of heat in their wake. Emma's breath hitched as he reached the apex of her thighs, his touch sending a jolt of pleasure through her. She arched into him, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice low and husky. "Yes," she breathed, her voice trembling with need. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. His fingers delved deeper, exploring her with a skill that left her gasping for air. Emma's hands clawed at the mat beneath her, her body writhing under his touch. The pleasure was overwhelming, each stroke sending her closer to the edge. But it wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed him. "Daniel," she moaned, her voice dripping with desperation. "Please." He understood immediately. With a swift movement, he shed his own clothes, his body as flawless as she remembered. He positioned himself between her legs, his eyes locking onto hers as he leaned down to capture her lips in a passionate kiss. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he entered her. Emma's breath caught, a wave of pure ecstasy washing over her as they became one. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back as he began to move, setting a steady rhythm that quickly had her gasping for air. Their bodies moved in perfect harmony, each thrust driving her closer to the edge. The room was filled with the sound of their ragged breaths and the slick, rhythmic sounds of their joining. Emma's mind was a haze of pleasure, the guilt that had plagued her earlier nowhere to be found. "Emma," Daniel groaned, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. "You feel so good." She could only nod, her body too overwhelmed to form words. Her hips moved of their own accord, meeting each of his thrusts with equal fervor. The sensations were too much, too intense, and she knew she wouldn't last much longer. Daniel seemed to sense it too. He reached between them, his fingers finding her sensitive nub and stroking it in time with his thrusts. The added stimulation pushed Emma over the edge, her entire body convulsing as wave after wave of pleasure crashed over her. Daniel wasn't far behind. With a final, deep thrust, he let out a guttural groan, his body shuddering as he found his release. He collapsed on top of her, both of them breathing heavily, their bodies still intertwined. For a long moment, they lay there, the only sound in the room, their ragged breaths. Emma's mind slowly began to clear, and as it did, the guilt came rushing back. Daniel raised his head, his eyes locking onto hers. "Emma,"